Good afternoon, everyone. It seems like maybe as our moderator today, I should just go ahead and begin us. We're welcome and glad to see everyone. I said good afternoon, but for those small part of us who are in the Western time zones, good morning. And I'm very pleased to be here with you all. I am happy to see the faces I can see on the screen. I am also engaging my hopefully capacious enough imagination to see all the people in the ballroom with your, interested faces. So we're going to go ahead and launch into this. I'm very excited. It's really a treat for me to work with the Center for Migration Studies. I always think of this as part of what they do is research with the holy process, with research as a holy process and with the holy purpose. And it's also a joy for me to be working with advocates, pastoral leaders, and scholars together. To me, this is how scholarship should be done. And I know my two colleagues agree with me on this. My name is Brett Hoover. I am Associate Professor of Pastoral and Practical Theology at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where I also direct our MA programs. I teach on migration and occasionally do research as well, although I started out as a parish research, which is how I ended up here hosting this panel. I do because of my teaching, I published a book called Immigration and Faith, which is a fine textbook for theology classes on migration. This panel is, however, focused on parish research and what parishes can do. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in a second, but the panel is called From Belief to Behavior, Promoting Immigrant-Friendly Parish Practices. And I think this kind of focus and topic really came to us from acknowledging that sometimes Roman Catholicism, we're very good at talking about our teachings and our doctrines around immigration. But one of the things I appreciate about the Center for Migration Studies is y'all are very interested in what people are actually doing and doing over and over again, the habitual actions, practices. And we have, the other panelists and I have observed that sometimes there are good practices going on, even when there is xenophobic talk in the air, et cetera. And that sometimes people are talking a good game, but not much is actually happening or even counterproductive practices. So we want to get into that a little bit today. So in the service of that topic, let me introduce our two panelists. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Susan Bigelow Reynolds, Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. And she is a theologian, an ethnographer, a parish researcher, and a wonderful colleague on the National Conversation on Shared Parish Life. Susan's latest book is People Get Ready, Ritual, Solidarity, and Lived Ecclesiology in Catholic Roxbury, published by Fordham University Press. Susan also has many articles, and I think of her as a public intellectual because of her work with Commonweal and also in a lot of quote unquote secular media. So we're very excited to have Susan with us today. We also have with us Dr. Eric Berayesa of the Society of Jesus, who is the newly appointed Dean of Messina College at Boston College. So congratulations, Eric, we're very excited for you there. Messina College is a new residential college for underserved and underrepresented students at Boston College, bestowing associate degrees. So they're about to start up. Eric is a sociologist, is specializing in urban sociology, although ironically, he's going to talk to us today about rural parish life, at least a little bit. So, but I think this just shows how Eric is a very versatile and powerful scholar. So we're excited to have him with us. He also is the son of immigrants, and maybe we may be hearing about some of his own personal experience with that. So for both of these wonderful scholars, we're going to try. We'll start off with Susan, and we'll give them each about 15 minutes to kind of share with us some of their research and experience. Then we'll conduct a little bit of a conversation among the three of us, and then we'll move to questions and answers. And I hope that is good for everybody. Does that sound good? All right. Okay. Well, then I will just turn this over to Dr. Susan Reynolds.
And I want to begin by introducing you all to one of my favorite parishes, St. Mary of the Angels in Roxbury, which is a neighborhood in Boston. It's predominantly Black and Latinx, Puerto Rican, Dominican primarily. I spent about 6 years at St. Mary's from about 2011 to 2017 doing the research that ultimately became my book, People Get Ready, which is out in January. And I initially set out to look at intercultural liturgy. I was really interested in questions of practice and ritual and how practice fostered relationships of solidarity across racial and cultural boundaries. And so naturally, the first place I looked was at the parish's bilingual liturgies and the public Holy Week processions and things of that nature, all of which were really fascinating and really compelling. But when I started asking parishioners who had immigrated, either recently or in the more distant past, how they got integrated into the fabric of the parish when they were newcomers, I expected them to talk about liturgy or the welcome that they received within the context of the liturgy, or I don't know. So I guess I don't know what I expected. But what I didn't expect is that a lot of them talked about the parish pastoral council. The parish pastoral council. I don't know how many of you have sat on your parish's parish pastoral council, but it's hard to imagine a less compelling, less sexy part of parish life than the parish council, speaking from experience. But so many people would tell me stories of the relationships that they formed on the parish council. Now, when I think of a parish council, I think of kind of the old guard, I guess. Before I was ever on a parish council, I'm not even sure if I had heard of them, but I guess if I had, I would assume that it would include sort of the, maybe the representatives of different ministries or kind of the old standard bearer faces. And in any case, because I had never really heard of a parish pastoral council, aside from studies on the outcomes of Vatican II, that showed me that this is maybe not a very consequential body in most parishes. But at St. Mary's, it was this really fascinating space of welcome and integration and lay leadership. Every week or every month when they met, they began by reciting the mission statement, the parish mission statement in English and Spanish. And they followed that with a reflection period in which they went around the table and invited people to share where they had seen the parish mission statement in action that month. Everything was translated in real time by a parishioner. And actually, parishioners had become so used to this that they had adopted this kind of stop and start verbal cadence to give time for the translator to translate whatever they had just said from Spanish to English or vice versa. Its members were, when I was there, about half from the Spanish-speaking community, half from the English-speaking community, which meant actually that English speakers were overrepresented because they were less than half of the parish. But there was at least this really longstanding attempt at equal representation with a focus on representation of new immigrants and new community members. And what's fascinating about that, I thought, was that membership wasn't based on seniority at all, or even on like a deep knowledge of the parish or its history. Parish participation wasn't seen as like a prize for longevity, but rather a necessity, a right, a duty of every parishioner. And so it became this really, really consequential space. And when I asked parishioners, where did you, who are your friends? Where did you make your friends? When did you start feeling connected? So many of them told me it was because their second or third week there, their second month at the parish, somebody had invited them to join the parish council. And I thought, gosh, that is so interesting. What I learned when I started going through Archdiocesan archives is that the St. Mary's Parish Council had actually a really radical history, which is also not something I tend to associate with parish councils, a radical history. When they were formed in 1969, right after Vatican II encouraged the establishment of councils like these, the first thing that they did was to move the parish's finances to Boston's only Black-run bank, which that was their first move as a show of solidarity with the people in the neighborhood and with parishioners who are at their parish. After that, the second thing they did was to write the Archbishop to try and secure permission to celebrate the Sunday Mass on Saturday night, which again was then like a new, on the cusp of being a new development after Vatican II. In response to that request, Cardinal Cushing wrote to the Vatican and received the ability to grant this dispensation to whatever parish wanted it, which meant that Saturday evening Mass, like the anticipatory Sunday Mass, came to Boston because poor and working class parishioners wanted the right to have a day of rest and leisure on Sunday. They said, we deserve this just as much as anybody else does who has a house on the Cape or a much more relatively privileged suburban life. After the parish ended up on the closure list in 2004, when Boston shuttered 80 of its parishes, it was the parish council that organized what ended up being a successful resistance campaign aimed at convincing the archdiocese that the parish was too vital to the neighborhood to close. So for decades, this council, this body of, maybe 15 parishioners, had worked in really concrete ways for economic and liturgical and social justice for their community. St. Mary's, like I said, is a pretty understaffed and under-resourced parish. So lay leadership there wasn't seen as like an opportunity, but it was really a necessity. Lay people had to take responsibility for the parish, and inviting people into that sense of responsibility right away, right when they arrived, was in some way a hallmark of this particular parish's practices. So what does that mean? When we think of parish practice, I think typically what we're thinking of is liturgy, just like I had. Conversations about integrating new immigrants in parish practices often center around questions of language and music and cultural aesthetics in the liturgy, all of which are very important and deeply important. I'm sure that we'll talk about that later. But what that also means, at least in my experience, is that we expect liturgy to do a tremendous amount of work, right? And we think about all the ways that we talk about the sacrament of Eucharist, for example, right? As making us all one, as breaking down boundaries, as drawing us together, and so on, which both theologically and phenomenologically, I think we believe to be true. But the flip side is that in parishes all across the country, what I hear people saying over and over again is, we don't need to talk about racism because we're all one in Christ. We don't need to talk, like, that's not an issue here. We're all one in Christ. We're all one in the Eucharist. What I found and what I want to underscore is that we should be thinking about parish practice in a much broader way, as really as an ecology of all sorts of different practices, of which liturgy is just one, right? When it comes to integration, liturgy corroborates the work that's being done beyond it. Practices of administration, of financial management, catechesis, of celebration, right? And more. These are practices that shape the structural reality of the parish. So that, as Brett sort of intimated in his introduction, right? One person's xenophobia, right? Or the xenophobia or ideology of a small faction of parishioners isn't ultimately determinative of the parish's mission, because you have a structure and a tradition in place. In urban parishes, I know Eric is going to talk about rural parishes. So I'll say in urban parishes, it's also really important to consider the parish as part of this broader urban ecology, right? So in a parish that serves new immigrants, it's often these other local institutions that also serve those immigrants and families. So what are the practices that help to integrate the parish itself into that local ecology, whether that's something liturgical like a Good Friday Stations of the Cross that visits these neighborhood institutions and service providers, or whether that's the parish's presence at a neighborhood festival or opening up the parish space as a meeting ground for different neighborhood institutions, right? I think a lot of times we think of parishes as islands, right? And I think some of that maybe is a kind of a vestige of like the 19th and early 20th century, like Catholic parallel subculture that Catholics built to serve their own, right, through schools and sodalities and Knights of Columbus and, hospitals. We all know our history, right? But parishes aren't islands anymore, and we don't have to be islands. And I think that a lot of times too, when we're working with new immigrants, there's this fear that, if we collaborate ecumenically, we're going to lose members to this Protestant church or that Protestant church. But I think that that's really a foolish way to go about things, right? We don't have to be so defensive. And so thinking about parish practices, not only as what we do internally, but also as what we do externally as well, to build the fabric of that local neighborhood. I will end there because again, I'm conscious of probably the background noise that's happening here, but also because I want to turn it over to Eric, and then I'm sure we'll have a much more extended conversation.
Well, okay. In the absence of further instruction, we're just going to charge forward. So I would like to invite Dr. Eric Berriesa to share with us his thoughts.
Thank you, Brett, for gathering us today for this panel with CMS. It's really great to be with you and Susan. I'm a fan of both of your work. And really to reflect on our research on immigration and the possible implications for receiving communities, particularly in the Catholic Church. So I was happy to receive this invitation, as my own work really considers the actions of religious congregations, both as corporate bodies, but also as individual actors within those institutions. So some of you here, I'm going to do the academic thing because I think it's important to situate my what I'm going to say in this context of lived religion. So some of you may be familiar with that study of lived religion. I think it's an encompassing term that has taken on several meanings since it was first introduced by religious historians, notably David Hall and Robert Orsi. It was a theoretical and methodological turn in religion that came on the heels of secularization and rational choice theories to show that religion was alive and well, and that we had simply lost a pulse for how to measure it. So this was trying to right the ship in a way. This category of lived religion has become pretty expansive, however. It's come to include what we know as popular religion, theology from below, ordinary and everyday religion, etc. And so often I think we misunderstand religion, lived religion, as that of individual believers. And we sort of forget that congregations are still really a part of that. So I'm drawing here on the work of Nancy Ammerman, who's my own mentor, a big sociologist of religion, to situate the need for more precision when we talk about religion as lived. Because a key contribution of some theorists is that congregations indeed matter, and we need to pay attention to those congregations. We can't somehow separate the individual actor from the churches that they come from. As Susan says, we aren't islands of religion. Even when we disaffiliate from a church, we still get our practices from somewhere. And so we need to recognize that. And congregations themselves live religion. They are sites of embodied action and practice. So I offer this brief introduction just to say that my own work is situated within lived religion, but more particularly in a practice approach. So I appreciated, Brett, your title, your framing for this talk about practice, really making that central. It begins with what people do, and that can't be separated from belief and the places that help them form those ideas. So for the research I share with you today, I spent a lot of time in churches, particularly in North Carolina. I was interested in how Latino immigrants practiced religion there, and I decided that I wanted to compare urban and rural locations. So studying the rural, I think, was a real change for me, as Brett has already alluded. I'm a city kid, and the urban is what I know best and what I've studied before. But as I spent time with congregations in the South, I was surprised that the rural site really helped me tear away some of the layers and focus more on these practices that were important for immigrant survival there. So I'm an ethnographer, and so my method is really about immersion in a community. I was able to follow the Latinos in my study from their churches into their spaces of everyday life. And so it's important to say, also say that this town that I call Douglas was experienced by many undocumented Latinos as a negative enforcement context. So the context is super important to know, are they pretty immigrant friendly, or is this a negative place for them? And in North Carolina, in 2019, when I'm doing this study, it's still pretty negative, right? Where policing actors there sought to immobilize Latinos and threaten their ordinary life. So this backdrop is important when we think about practices because it's the context, of course, or at least a context, because not all religion took place at the site of this church. So included also in my sample were interlocutors from mainline Protestant churches, evangelical Protestant churches, and of course the Catholic Church. And so although Douglas is a town of about 2,000 people, it's richly diverse, and the immigrant religion scene there was no different. The one thing that I will say about the sites is that Latino churches were more often located at the outskirts of town. They're much more entrepreneurial, where land is inexpensive and widely available. And so when we think about, just to follow Susan's image of ecology, the ecology here is not that there's several Catholic churches. You are the Catholic Church in sort of a sea of a religiously diverse background. And there's lots of other traditions that you have to contend with. So the two churches that I'm thinking at the outskirts of town included the Catholic Church. We're 13 miles from the town, just to give you a little bit of sense of distance and space. And they sat directly across the street from one another. They maintained Douglas addresses, but were on unincorporated county land along a simple country road, which in some ways added to the precarity that some members experience. So that isolated location, it turned out, was in a favored area for police checkpoints. That's going to come in just a moment when I talk about this notion of retenes, the checkpoints that polices, as they're known in Spanish, became a practical concern for these immigrants in those spaces. So one question that arose was, how do you get to church and home again safely? So you can already begin to see that implicated here are not only questions of religion, but also immigration and then spatial contours. So let me talk about some of the practices that I saw in Douglas. Again, that's a pseudonym. I'm going to frame this within practices of the Catholic Church, but I'll also provide some comments on where I think we have some learning to do from other churches, since I looked at them as well. Now, the first I want to mention is that time of prayers of petition or intercession that are often offered after the homily and the creed. Usually these are prepared in advance by someone from a pastoral team. Sometimes they're prepared by the pastor himself. Now, I asked my participants about how often immigration was discussed at Mass in their experience, and the most common response referenced was this time of petitions. It was a time when they felt the pastor recognized the experience, albeit briefly. Now, this is in itself has little to do, I think, with rurality or urbanism. It's a practice that transcends type of place, but the way in which petitions were offered at the churches in Douglas, I think, engaged congregants such that they offered the prayers themselves. And it's important to also think back to that ecology, that the Catholic Church existed within a pretty tightly known ecology of religion. So you know what all the other churches are doing because it's a town of 2,000 people. So indeed, the Catholic Church took on this practice of allowing the parishioners to voice their own prayers of petition as an adaptation they made after hearing about some of the petitions that were being offered at that Baptist church across the street. At the Baptist church, they did this from a kneeling position, and they shared in detail these petitions to God for protection and safety as immigrants, but also about specific experiences from the past week. And because the size of the congregation was also small, the pastor there would often repeat back what he had heard from the person offering the petition. Given the size of the church space in the Catholic Church was a little larger, what they did there was they positioned two microphones where parishioners could come and do the same thing, offer their petitions during this time. So yes, it took time, but it allowed those in the pews to pray along with the concerns of their fellow parishioners and friends. Prayers were being offered for their homelands, but there was also the local concerns that were being raised. Some spoke about their lack of a social network in a foreign place. Estamos aquí solos, one said. A recurrent theme was an attack on their movement, as I mentioned, on their automobility, to use the specific term that we use as sociologists. But for those who lacked driver's licenses, of course, they also spoke about exclusion from healthcare, job insecurity, anxiety about deportation threats, to name a few others. Now, what I saw in these moments was an escape valve of sorts, a time when members could speak about their lives and call upon God to accompany them in those challenges. Time didn't seem to matter. Didn't matter if it took 30 minutes, sometimes it took a little less. So this practice differed from what I saw at the Catholic Church at my urban site, of course, which was much larger, and where the type of intercessory prayer was more prescribed. It was, and I think it led a number of parishioners there to state that their ordained religious leaders were not so intimately aware of their struggles. I know there are practical reasons, of course, for the prepared prayers, but reading petitions in that case resulted in the removal of the ordinary practitioner and their particular needs. And so a question I would raise is, how are intercessory prayers enacted in worship, and what are people praying for?
Honduras and the Caribbean zone that I want.
So next, I want to talk a little bit about processions, going outdoors from church space, and so extending the religious ritual and blurring the ordinary sight of communal religion. Of course, processions like intercessions are common to Catholicism, but they can also take on important meaning given the context and narratives of those people who are enacting them. So I've spoken about the precarity of space already for some of the Latinos I met in North Carolina. And so taking to rural country roads where those threats of immobilization exist, I thought was a pretty big deal. When you live under the fear of deportation or even harassment, that's a pretty important action, going to that same road that was dangerous before. It doesn't stop being dangerous just because you start walking in a procession with your church, right? It's something to behold, though, this procession through miles of desolate country road. I came to discover that these processions had the effect of extending the safety that they experienced and nurtured in their church to the space of the broader rural community. The distance that they traveled ranged from 1.5 miles to sometimes more than 20 miles. And whatever the occasion, the procession redefined this experience of fear into one of safety, bringing the safety that they experience as a community out onto those country roads. We often assume that immigrants, particularly the undocumented, want to be invisible, that they want to hide, that hiding is a tactic of them and necessary for their survival. But what I experienced belies that. In fact, the church and local enforcement actors were quite entangled in a back and forth. And the enforcement actors existed as both enforcer of laws, but also a provider of safety. So let me explain briefly what I mean here. So one procession was a celebration called the Antorcha de Guadalupe. Some of you might be familiar with this. It took place in November in anticipation of a big celebration on December 12th to Our Lady of Guadalupe. It celebrates a flame that is carried on a torch from the Basilica to Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, all the way to New York City. This is an elaborate transnational practice that requires lots of coordination with a network of churches. Bob Smith writes a good book called Mexican New York, where he highlights some of this practice. For the Catholic Church in Douglas, it meant organizing runners that would traverse 30 miles in order to deliver this torch with the flame to the next congregation. So indeed, the framing by a church leader described the practice like this. I want to share with you, this is how she's describing it. to the runners that were going to participate that day, she says, I want to share with you that this is not a marathon. This is a prayer in which we are bringing good news to others. We're praying for ourselves and for all immigrants and people of this place, because we are all brothers and sisters. Well, when I celebrated this event there with them, I wondered about their fear, of course, of being on the road. A sheriff arrived some 30 minutes into this procession when the procession was underway, and it became clear that the sheriff was hired then by the church to accompany the procession, and by consequence legitimated this practice in the eyes of onlookers and people in the town. Here, I think, was a strategic decision by the church that the same sheriff who earlier might initiate a roadblock that had then near their church to police unlicensed drivers was now the same person responsible for the safety of the church when they were on the road. These are just a couple of practices, of course, but I selected them because I think they're practices that speak about adaptations and respond to the experience of Latino immigrants, at least in this particular context in North Carolina. More than the practices, though, I think we need to develop a lens through which we look at the immigrants in our pews. I think we need to listen better, speaking a little bit more as a Jesuit now. I think we need to listen better. We need to be willing to understand their experience, and we need to make adaptations to our communal practices when possible. I think the Catholic Church that I studied did a pretty good job of that. They adapted their prayers of petition, for instance, because the Baptist church across the street simply did it better. And they learned also to strategize and work around the threats particular to living in a rural context, where the experience of immigration enforcement was negative. So I'm going to stop there as well. Look forward to our chat.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, both of you. This is wonderful reflections and very rich. I'm going to try to launch us off in a conversation here. But before I do, I did want to reiterate what the organizers were saying. If you have questions for our panelists or for us as a panel together, please consider putting those in the chat. You can do that anytime now, and we'll try to get those in once we begin with a little bit of a conversation. I would also, I would encourage that to the people who are here online. For the people that are in the ballroom, I believe they have a microphone that will be set up. So be thinking about what questions or thoughts you want to share. So one of the things that I was really struck by in the presentations that both of you gave, Eric and Susan, was there's a number of things, right? One of the things I hope we'll come back to is this, as you put it, Susan, this question of non-sexy practices, the kind of things that are very quotidian and that we do every day. I think in Latino theology we would call them lo cotidiano, but I wanted to start with this because one of the things that struck me about both the petition example, the Prayers of the Faithful example, in Eric's conversation, and your conversation, Susan, about the Parish Pastoral Council, is the way in which each was constructed in order to provide agency to immigrants who were arriving. And I think that I wonder if you have further thoughts about that, or how that works, or why that's important. I thought about how often, I think with very good intentions and doing very much good, but a lot of our parish institutions are supplying welcome and integration efforts with immigrants through acts of direct service. And that is super important, especially when people first arrive. But unless we're careful, it can really turn into a paternalistic attitude, which may already be there in already resident communities. So I'm interested in this question of, the way that the Pastoral Council was just kind of like gathering people in. I thought of like hens with their chicks, and the way the petition just made this kind of spontaneous space for people to offer their petitions, albeit, as you noted, Eric, in part in competition with the Baptist Church. but I'm wondering how you think that spontaneity and space and room for people to actually take the reins a little bit made a difference in terms of welcoming and integrating immigrants.
I think that's a great question. I can start us off and then I'll turn it to Eric. think that, and Eric, I loved that you mentioned the intercessions, because that was also a really important part of the liturgical practice at St. Mary the Angels in Roxbury, in both English speaking and Spanish speaking communities, which I should clarify again, both in had as members both recent immigrants and those who'd immigrated decades prior. More of the Spanish speaking community was made up of new immigrants, but both communities included immigrants. The prayers of the faithful served so many different purposes simultaneously. They were a way of spreading news, right? This is how you found out what was going on in the community, what was going on in the neighborhood, who was affected within the community by an act of violence or sort of a current event that people had heard about, but maybe they didn't necessarily know who was affected. So it served this sort of information dissemination purpose. Of course, it served the purpose of prayer, right? Of kind of claiming divine solidarity in the wake of struggles, or in the, or gratitudes as well. And it also really helped, Brett, as you said, to kind of claim the sense of agency. And there's a deep theological agency, I think, that comes in a practice like that. There's a theological and ecclesiological agency that comes in being part of the parish pastoral council, right? There's a theological agency that happens when, you're organizing, okay, what are our stations on this Good Friday, Stations of the Cross, that's taking place throughout the streets of the neighborhood, which is a practice that I looked at really closely in my own work. I saw this too, again, that theme of agency in the protests against closure in 2004. Parishes like St. Mary's that were very small, that were very under-resourced, that were in buildings that were decrepit or on the brink of it. St. Mary's is interesting. It's actually in a basement. They never, in 1906, all they got to was the basement, and they said, okay, we'll raise the rest of the money later, but for now we'll put a roof over the basement chapel and call that your parish. And 100 and some years later, they're still in the basement. They never built the top of the church, which is like so symbolic in some ways. It's kind of this church it feels like you're in a subway station, right? Which is again like this really rich metaphor. But the thing that happened to parishes like St. Mary's in 2004 was that they were either closed, or they were made sort of like chapels of existing parishes or missions of existing larger, more well-resourced parishes. And the thing that was so fascinating when I was going through all of these documents that the community had saved from that period, it was like an archivist's dream. Actually, one of the sort of parish matriarchs just like hands me this giant file folder full of meticulously preserved. This is in the era when we were printing out emails, right? So, there was everything. There were newspaper articles, there were meeting minute notes. It was incredible. So I got a really intimate look at how parishioners conceived of this fight to keep the parish open. And one thing that I thought was so interesting was that they didn't want to be like a mission of a larger parish or a wealthier parish or a suburban parish. They wanted to be a community that was an ordinary city parish, right? They wanted that self-determination that they had always had to say, this is our community. We're not somebody else's charity. And so I think that reading not just really obvious practices of like leadership through the lens of agency, but also these really intimate practices of community and administration and organization as different forms of that claiming of self-determination and deep spiritual and theological and ecclesiological agency, I think is really, really important. Eric, what do you have to say?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I was thinking about a parish I studied actually in Boston, in Charlestown, where it was a shared parish also, and they were struggling to sort of figure out how to do a bilingual mass. They're reducing the number of masses, and the Spanish were, of course, losing out. And one of the parishioners, Spanish-speaking parishioners there, said to me, "Quiero sentir mi misa." I want to feel my mass. It was such a beautiful, simple statement about why being able to, say have mass in Spanish was important to him. And I think there's a similar experience going on with the offering of petitions, being able to voice something, right? They're able to feel a participant to something. I often think about the anthropologist, the work of the anthropologist James Scott, the idea of weapons of the weak. When you talk about how peasant revolutions happened, he explains, is it's not these big overt actions. They're sort of everyday, ordinary kinds of actions that really was where their voice was being expressed. Now, this is not a revolution, right? What's going on here, but I think it's an interesting parallel to think about how those with little power are still sort of carving out spaces for themselves within these congregations. I think the pastor the Catholic pastor in this rural town sort of noticed, out of a practical reason, if I don't offer this, they're just going to vote with their feet and go across the street, right? They're kind of dueling parishes, dueling congregations. And so I think people finally sort of got what they wanted there, and it made a huge difference in how they experienced church, right? That they could also, and the pastor learned a lot more about his congregation by being able to have them express what was meaningful to them, what struggles they had during their week.
Thank you both. I am struck too by in terms of this people feeling, and I love that expression in Spanish about feeling the mass, Eric. In terms of people feeling, at least in some way, as participants, as being in the driver's seat, as having some control over their destinies in the context of the parish that they love. I was thinking also what you said, Susan, about earlier about translation and how people got into the rhythm of translation in the pastoral council, so much so that they expected it, they made space for it. I was thinking about that in contrast to in a parish that I studied that was Spanish speaking, and the English speaking side was the African American community, about how the kind of parish liturgical committee did not become that kind of space because of the translation issues that the people who are recent immigrants, and that, I mean, they spoke some English, but they didn't feel comfortable expressing themselves. The translation was performed by a parish leader who just wasn't really good at it. And there's not endless resources or endless bilingual people in a lot of parishes where that's even capable. But it struck me how just even like being able to be heard in a group, in a shared context like that, through the use of good interpretation, can make a big difference. And we often don't think of that as, and especially if people don't know about translation or don't think about it, have never tried to do it. I have done it many times and I'm lousy at it. But at the same time, it's a delicate art, and it's one of those funny things too, where it repeats all the weird power dynamics that we have in our parishes. Where I can remember many times where a parish secretary who was translating sort of watered down the point of somebody that made a point so that wouldn't be offensive to the priest. But still, even so, to be able to make space for people to share their experience. Which leads me to another question about that, at least some of the context you were talking about involves shared parishes where there are English and Spanish speaking communities. And I'm struck by what you said, Eric, about listening, that the language barrier can really get in the way of listening. And I wonder what besides translation, are there other practices that, because I'm not sure that that's always necessary. I mean, I can think of a priest I knew who really couldn't speak Spanish worth anything, but he was so great at going to the dances of the Latino community and dancing, with the older women, and so they really loved him, and in a strange way, because of his symbolic role, it made people feel more a part of the parish. But I'm wondering if there's other practices that we can do to kind of increase the ability for there to be a sense of listening across the cultural and language barriers.
Maybe I'm happy to start. I had a Jesuit in Chiapas once tell me you can't trust a skinny missionary. So he was just trying to say, get out there and eat with the people, right? Receive anything that they give you, and they're gonna talk to you and speak about it's about spending time with them in a lot of ways, right? As an ethnographer, being invited to someone's house is like the golden ticket, right? It's like exactly, because you learn so much about them. They're opening up their doors to you, right, into a space that is usually private. I mean, if you're the pastor in some relationship of leadership in the church, people are going to open up those doors. And I think we make a bigger thing sometimes out of language barrier, because so much of closeness is not communicated through words, right? It's just that someone took the time, as you're mentioning with the example of going to the dances, right? Someone just took the time to be with us. And the other thing that we often seem to forget with, at least with Latinos, is that they speak a lot more English than they even give themselves credit for, right? They might be embarrassed to say a few words in English, but they have a lot more ability than we know. And so I think we need to sort of expect that as well.
I think those are all really great points. It reminds me of of two things, actually. One thing is, I remember so distinctly one of the sort of lay leaders, who was white, older Euro-American woman, an English-speaking Masoret who'd been a parishioner for a really long time and had collaborated across the two communities. We had many conversations during my time there, but the sentence of hers that just sticks out to me, she said, "We have to work hard at hearing one another's voices." And I think about that a lot, because it is work, right? It's a work. I mean, when I was sitting in parish council meetings, and it was just slow. I mean, also because the community had this kind of deliberative sort of communal discernment sort of sense, where sometimes you're like, oh my goodness, please someone just come in and be a monarch and make a decision. And you're like, it's 9 o'clock, I want to go home. But of course the translation, right? It was slow. And the person who would frequently do the translating, I remember there would always be beads of sweat running down his head. I mean, it's labor. It's hard intellectual labor, but there's a physicality to it that's really hard, and it's a skill. But there was something that was so radically inconvenient, right? Just like distressingly so at times. So I don't want to romanticize this, right? Sometimes it was like, gosh, this is really taking a long time. And wouldn't it just be so much easier if we didn't do it this way, right? But if they didn't do it this way, then they would lose this space of profound collaboration, and almost kind of like there was a deep justice that was enacted in that space, especially because that council was so powerful in the sense of there was this tradition of lay leadership, and that was one of the spaces in which that leadership was worked out. And so the commitment to doing things in a slow, deliberative, inconvenient, stop and start sort of way, right, that was sort of like right and just. But I think about that a lot, because it's work. There is a real labor to it. And there were parishioners who were newcomers, more recent newcomers, who were not immigrants, who were just white, honestly, like white people looking for like a diverse parish, who would get kind of annoyed because they would come, even though they thought they were looking for like a diverse parish, with the expectation that they were still going to somehow like be on the inside, right? They wanted diversity, but there was something in the way that they talked to me, which I should say was not how I'm assuming they would talk to others, probably people of color, but there was like a sense of camaraderie, like, oh, you're also an educated white woman. Almost a disappointment or a frustration that, this community is almost working too hard at it. Like they should be, yeah, one person phrased it as like, it's taking away from just like normal, so like normal community, or like normal, you know, basically what she was lamenting was that it was work, right? People were so committed to this intercultural, these sort of intercultural relationships in a place where you wouldn't necessarily be likely to expect them, right? This wasn't, for those of you familiar with the Paulus Center in Boston, you know, this wasn't like kind of a really super progressive, predominantly white, like highly educated space, right? This was a real urban parish located in what has historically been Boston's like deep inner city. And so the fact that people were so non-negotiably committed to this mission of relationship across difference at this parish was like really, it was really jarring to people in some way, especially like white people who kind of assumed that they would automatically like feel comfortable there, and they weren't. So that's interesting. But the other thing, Brett, that I was thinking of when you said that was like Catholicism, the beauty of Catholicism is that it's a body language to it, right? It's like, it's so embodied, the ritual life of Catholicism in the liturgy and beyond. So I think of one woman who was reflecting with about how she really liked the Palm Sunday procession from the park, like a couple blocks away to the parish, because unlike on Good Friday, when they could just process through the streets, on Palm Sunday, it was kind of a smaller affair. So they had to stay on the sidewalks, and you'd get bottlenecked, and you'd kind of get jostled and like mixed up. If you try to save a seat in the parish, like it would not work because people would just sit wherever. But like by the time you're in there, you know, you're sitting next to somebody that you've never met before, and you're like physically like rubbing shoulders with everybody, and you're, you know, and the Palm Sunday Mass is really long, so you're sitting among strangers for 2 hours basically. And there's like, she was talking about, it was so interesting because she was talking, and I never would have really thought of that, but like the intimacy that comes from kind of getting mixed up on purpose, that happens in those kind of processions and other public rituals. But I just thought, gosh, there's something so important about the embodied reality of so much of what this ritual represents.
I do want to open this up to our audience in both places a little bit, but maybe just to follow up by answering my own question. Yeah, I think I was thinking about what you said, Susan, about the work involved, intercultural work. And that, you know, it's like making those connections takes some effort. There are sort of micro things you can do which do not take as much work. And I think about things like, mindful of what you just said about the embodied nature of things like the sign of peace, you know, where people reach out across ethnic or racial lines frequently without too much thought, even sometimes attempting to speak in the other person's language, sometimes badly. But all that really makes a difference. But I was also thinking about how in every successful kind of shared parish that I've seen, there kind of rises up a crop of sort of cultural interpreters back and forth, like people who kind of specialize in a way. And some of that is the leadership, but some not. You know, I can think sometimes it's people that don't even have language skills or whatever. They just like people or are curious about another culture. But I think those people often like serve a function in terms of funneling information back and forth in ways across the language barrier. You know, sort of gente puente, as they say in Spanish, bridge people. But it seems like that's really important, and in both directions. You know, I think an immigrant community needs to know what the receiving community is talking about and thinking about. And also sometimes you know, and then kind of some of the literature on, you know, bridging social capital, we know that sometimes the receiving community can really provide resources that nobody in the immigrant community knows about. So it seems like those people are really important in keeping that listening going back and forth. I do want to, I have other questions, but I did want to stop. I don't know if either in the ballroom or online we have, I don't see any questions yet on the chat, but maybe people would like to ask a question either in the ballroom or online. I think in the app, while people maybe are still thinking about their online questions, maybe we can go to the ballroom and see if there's anybody that wants to ask a question from the microphone there. Oh, it looks like maybe Mary Kay, you wanted to ask a question? No. Okay. Anything from the ballroom? Someone is approaching.
Thank you so much for all the presenters. Those were super interesting vignettes that you shared with us. I noticed that most of them had to do with parishes where there was a large immigrant presence within the parish itself. But I'm wondering if you have any advice or thoughts to parishes where there's not an immigrant presence within that specific parish, but there's a desire to perhaps reach out to a neighboring parish where there might be more of an immigrant presence or something of that nature?
A good question. Thank you for that. I'll say just right off the bat that one of the ways in which I think some parishes do that is by sister parish programs, where they make connection with an immigrant heavy parish. But when they do that, I think mindful of what I was saying before about paternalism, those relationships are often conceived of in terms of a wealthier parish providing resources for a poorer parish, which is okay. But I think the really successful sister parish arrangements are the ones where people actually go back and forth, where they travel to the immigrant community and have a picnic, where they invite people in for particular events, a fiesta or something. I mean, I think there needs to be some kind of, one-to-one exchange, but I'll open that up to the other panelists for their thoughts.
I think the parish I can think about in Boston, another parish that I can think about in Boston used to have a transnational trip, always some kind of service trip to some place. So I think you're right. It does become sort of this religious tourism, right? It's really about the best resource parish being able to go down and do some kind of project for another place. I once asked one of those parishes on the receiving end of those tourist projects what they thought. They said we'd get a lot more done if they sent a bigger check down here. But part of it, it's sometimes it's about a relationship. It's about the experience of the sending church, feeling something too and learning something. So, I mean, I think we can't discount the learning that goes on that end. I think we do have to sort of be mindful of the voyeurism that can happen,
I'll add thoughts if there's not another question, but if there is another question, then I want to make time for that. Doesn't look like there is right now, so I'll just add a couple of thoughts to go along with that. At St. Mary's in Boston, it was the first parish I'd ever been at in which I was on, and I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but I lived in the rectory for a year. They didn't have a priest in residence by that time, as most Boston parishes don't. And I was in graduate school and I needed a place to live. And I thought, this is perfect. But I lived as kind of a minister of presence in the rectory for a year. And so I really got to experience the life of that community from the inside out. And it was the first time I've ever been at a parish that was on the receiving end of the angel tree kind of gifts at Christmas time, right? I'm used to, now I have my daughters, take one off the tree and use their allowance money to, purchase a present for a kid. But St. Mary's was that parish. They were the one that received all the Christmas gifts, and the parish counted on it. It was really great. But it was just funny to me because that relationship with this suburban parish had begun decades earlier out of one of lots of ultimately pretty unsuccessful diocesan attempts, archdiocesan top-down attempts to foster some kind of solidarity between suburban wealthier parishes and inner city quote unquote parishes. And they tried this, they tried that, they tried this, and everything just kind of atrophied. And the only vestige of those really high-minded attempts at solidarity was this Christmas gift share, which again, it shows you what's what kind of happens to even the best attempts. They kind of peter off into this kind of one way, one day a year sort of act of service, where there's really not any sort of relationship whatsoever. And I just, I just kind of shows that like anything that's really meaningful in that respect, whether it's with a parish, a city away or right next door, has to really begin in a spirit of solidarity, right? This sense that like our salvation is bound up together, like with one another. Like I might have things that would be helpful for you, but I am convinced that what you have where you are is necessary for the salvation of my soul. And I think short of that, it's really hard to do anything that is meaningful to people on both sides of that relationship. But that doesn't mean we can't try.
Yeah, no, the trying seems important, doesn't it? That some things may not work out very well in the end, but we have to keep trying things.
Exactly.
One of my own mentors in ministry said, "Well, we're just going to keep trying stuff until something works." But I was also thinking about how sometimes when we're a non-immigrant church or a receiving community, even if we're not a direct receiving community church, that one of the things we should, I think, and mindful of what you said about our salvation is all bound up together. That one of the postures we should really take is as a learning church. And that's where we can really ask people to come in and teach us. We don't, and I mean, I think there's a wonderful humility in saying we don't have immigrants here. We don't know about that experience, but we need to know. Help us. And there's plenty, there's often plenty of resources around and I think also something that it's CMS gatherings we have talked about for eons is the relative lack of energy and visibility to teaching about immigration in Catholic parishes, even sometimes when we're like so intent upon teaching in other areas. And this is, of course, why we're in the mess we're in, because people assume it isn't very important to the Catholic tradition when it is incredibly so. So thanks. Yeah. I did want to, again, make room if there's anybody that has questions, either electronically here, virtually in the room, or people in the room, in the ballroom. We just have just a couple of minutes left here till we need to bring it to close. Anybody else with questions?
I think what you were talking about earlier, that we start things and then they kind of peter out. One of the problems that we have is our pastors move. So you have a pastor who's all gung-ho and he went to seminary with the other guy and they're all together and then they move. And it's kind of, that I think that's one of the ways, at least I see in my diocese, that things peter out. But in terms of getting the parishes to talk about it, I mean, what do you think the future is with the Bishops' Conference in terms of them really making immigration as one of the top priorities? Is there any conversations around that?
Maybe either of you have more insight into the Bishops' Conference than I do. I do. I mean,
I do
feel
not.
hopeful about that. In the sense, I mean, we noticed that Robert McElroy, the Bishop of San Diego here in California, was recently made a cardinal, which suggested some sense of, and I think it was mainly because of his efforts around the issue of immigration there at the border between San Diego and Tijuana. And so I do have some sense that there is movement in that area, but I couldn't say more than that. I don't know if Susan or Eric, you want to say anything? Okay, I do think that about the pastor moving issue, I've sometimes talked in my work about the canonical monopoly of a priest pastor, that they kind of, what they say goes, and that's the way it's built in, that's structurally built into the system. But I once had a German Catholic scholar say to me, he said, a lot of what I see in your writing is talking about the role of the pastor. And he's basically saying that it is like when you have good authority, then good things happen. And then he said that would never work in Germany because of their history. They're so cautious about the use of authority, so kind of allergic to the priest always leading the way. And I think sometimes we should listen to that, in that we don't need to wait always. We don't always need to wait for the pastor to do things. Sometimes the pastor can squash things, but I think there's all kinds of leadership in a parish, and it's one thing to wait for the pastor. It's another thing for the pastor to actually squash something. I think many pastors are very reluctant to do that. So I don't know if either of you wanted to add to that. I think we have, sorry, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I've seen that as well, where the real entrepreneurs are the people themselves. You know, if they want something, they're going to start it, and with or without the agreement of the pastor. Like I've seen women's groups start up in people's homes because the pastor didn't give them space, and eventually, you know, sort of got sanctioned by the church. So people are going to determine what they need, and they're going to carve out and find ways to achieve it.
And that theologically, this is what we mean by the baptismal priesthood, right? It does not all, it never has and never should depend entirely on the ordained. Yeah, I believe we may have reached the end of our time. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have one more question.
Okay, thank
you for the presentation, but I have a question because you are dealing with this one from a Latino context, but we do have other languages coming into the country, and the accommodation sometimes is good, but many times there is that as inconvenient. So, however, we see it very important that languages celebrated in the ethnic or national language of the immigrant community becomes also a source of evangelization. And how do you address this issue? Because we are here mostly trying to accommodate the Latin or Hispanics speaking, but the other communities being smaller, but there still is that issue of a need, but an outreach as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That seems so important. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And as you say, it's an instrument of evangelization. People need to pray in the language of their hearts. You know, that is just true. And it also has a solidarity forming function, you know, that people who may be lonely or new to a country, then to get together with people who speak their own language is a kind of earthly salvation. That's a piece of the greater salvation. So thanks for that. Yeah, did either one of my colleagues want to speak to that?
No, I mean, I'll just say I'm really glad that you named that. I think that the sort of English speaking, Spanish speaking binary really governs a lot of like church teaching and bishops, you know, letters and pastoral practice and kind of our theological thinking on migration and in parish practice. Really to the neglect of a great deal of communities. I mean, I think a lot about like St. Catherine Drexel in Boston, for example, which has this kind of moniker of like the quote unquote Black Catholic parish. But within that parish, right, there's this African American community and there's an African community, predominantly Nigerian, but kind of Pan-African in a way. And those two communities do not often see eye to eye. There's, you know, in the past, in different points, you know, there's been a lot of compromise, a lot of conflict. It's not, you know, I think people see race, they see language, even, I mean, honestly, even within, you know, quote unquote, Latino parishes or Latinx parishes, you know, I think there's that tendency, especially from those like in positions of power, to see everybody as a monolith. But even within Latinx parishes, which I know Brett and Eric obviously know, there's tremendous diversity. And at St. Mary the Angels in Boston, like that was actually people's greater source of concern. When I would talk to people in the Spanish Mass community, it wasn't like, oh, the English speakers are at it again. It was like, the merengue music is not how I pray. Like, I'm from Colombia. Like, doesn't even feel Catholic to me. So, you know, being more attentive to the variety of contexts that people are coming from, I think that you're just raising a tremendously important issue. And it gets to that question, right, of how do we serve people in a diverse church, right? We can all look back to the, you know, national parish era where, you know, if you had enough folks and you were in a certain, you know, in a diocese that was up for it, like, you know, okay, congratulations, you can build St. Casimir's, whatever, you can build St. Hedwig's, you can build St. you know, Anthony or whoever to serve your people in your language, and you can bring over your own priests. And we don't do that anymore. And what that means is that really for all new immigrants, whether you're part of a Spanish speaking, you know, minority, but significant minority, or whether you're, the only Portuguese speaker, or, like in your entire city, there's still this expectation that we put upon new immigrants to find their way within a really diverse community. And that's really, really hard. And I think that the need that you're raising is really important.
Maybe I'll just add, can I just add one quick thing? I agree with everything that's been said, but maybe one piece is there's always the vocation piece, right? And I would say that as an immigrant church, we need to do better about promoting vocations among young people of all types of diverse communities. And so the immigrant church, I think, should have more language just represented in their priesthood, but that's going to mean, and in their religious life, that's going to mean that we promote vocations even in our own homes,
Yeah, I'm also mindful of how oftentimes people who do promote vocations are not really considering the most marginalized of communities. Here in Los Angeles, we have a lot of people from indigenous communities in Latin America, especially in Guatemala and Mexico, who are Maya speaking and other languages. And there's not many people running around there looking for priests, but they should be. And the kind of last thing I wanted to say is that I'm with my own students, I'm always saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I can think of a couple places where they have large Filipino communities where the mass is not in Tagalog and most of the people speak English quite well, but the music is in Tagalog or in some other Filipino language, Cebuano, whatever. So I think sometimes those half measures can be sometimes in an interim way, but especially with music, it can really touch people's hearts when they don't have the resources to find a priest who speaks the language or something like that. Any final questions, or have we reached the end of our time together?
Yeah, I think we've reached the end of our time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Thank you again, Dr. Susan Reynolds, Dr. Eric Berayesa of the Society of Jesus. I'm Brett Hoover. We're so pleased to be with you. Thank you very much.
It's also really easy to find information about the people in your community. So what are the demographics of the people in the areas around you? Because maybe there's a lot of people that you could be serving, that you should be serving, but you're not because you don't know that they're there. And so research is just a very basic tool that you can use in order to find out who is around, who is with you and who is around you so that you can figure out who you should be serving. The what is what do they want and what do they need? And so there are more effective ways of asking people what do they want and what do they need, and there are less effective ways. And oftentimes parishes and religious organizations that don't do a lot of basic research or don't have people who are skilled in this particular area or don't know anything about survey taking, they ask the wrong questions, and then they're not actually able to figure out what it is that they should be providing to their people. And so then they're not as effective as they could be. Third is where, and where is not about location, but it's about where are their leverage points. So this is also something this is something that is a bit more complicated. So if you're trying to affect change, such as bringing in more families to your church, or getting more families who are affiliated with your church to go to school, or trying to connect your refugee families that you're serving with medical providers and they're not going to appointments and you're not sure why, there's going to be a leverage point that helps you to facilitate getting from your problem to your solution. And oftentimes that leverage point isn't where you as the provider think that it is. So doing research, you're able to identify the leverage point so that you can then be more effective in doing the things that you are setting out to do. It's basically how can you be more effective, more efficient in your success of helping people. And then lastly is evaluate. So are your efforts actually effective? And this is important because, like as Jacqueline said, you want to be able to show your deliverables, be able to demonstrate, hey, this is why my organization is really important. This is how much work we're doing. Therefore, donors, don't you want to give us more money so that we can help more people? But then it's also important to evaluate and reconsider how you measure success. So if you're resettling families, if you as a small organization resettled 25 families in your city, that's great. That is a fantastic accomplishment and it should not be diminished. But if you don't know that you resettled 25 families out of 2,000 families that were there that needed help, then you're losing that context in order to understand the impact and also to understand the potential reach that your agency and your organization could have. So this isn't to say that if you're an agency that does resettlement or that does education, or if you're a parish, that you're going to be able to successfully, or that you should strive to serve absolutely everybody. But having that context for a more objective level evaluation about the success and the limitations of your services helps you evaluate, where do you want your program to go? Where are you being really successful? What actually is your wheelhouse? And where can you focus your energies going forward when either your resources decrease, like during times of COVID, or when they increase because you got donors or you got a federal grant or something like that?
Thanks, Kiku. And I just wanted to show one thing that CMS had, developed a few years back that we've actually just updated the data for. We haven't built it into the interactive system yet, but we have, made the estimates. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. When talking about, knowing who's in your area, one thing that CMS does is, we produce estimates of different immigrant populations at a very small geographic level. So you can know in your area, how many undocumented immigrants there are, what are their demographics, how many people are eligible for TPS. And what we did one time back in 2017, can you see my screen now? Great. We had done this for at a diocese level. So we have this database where you can actually, by your diocese or archdiocese, I just selected Milwaukee for now. You can search for these different immigrant groups. So right now I've selected Haitian and Caribbean immigrants. We also have, migrant farm workers or Brazilian immigrants, African immigrants. This we had developed for PCMRT. And so it was the groups that were done by their request. But then you can see, how many years they've been in the US, for example, for these Haitian and Caribbean immigrants, what ages they are, if they're citizens, non-citizens, what gender they are, their English proficiency. And so if you know this about not only the people you're serving, but the people you're not serving, and you look into the people in your area, this is done exactly at a diocese level. And so you can actually look at your diocese level and see, like, who do we need to serve? Who's receiving Medicaid? How many people are employed? Who's in poverty? What's the average income? The occupations people are working in. And so that, as Kiki was saying, it can help you know not only who you're serving, but who you're not serving. And so I'm just going to drop this link in the chat. These numbers are from 2017, but we will be, updating them to more recent numbers soon. But even so, it gives you kind of still an idea of the general demographics of your area, of the area you're serving. And so I guess now I'd just like to open it up to, some discussion. And I'm just going to pose it to you, how have you used research in your work, or how have you not used research that you are hoping to, or do maybe you don't know where to start and you have questions about where to start. And so I'd just like to throw it out there and just before you speak, if you just introduce yourself and, for everybody in the chat, and so we all kind of get to know each other. And yeah, if any of you have any thoughts about how you have used research or how you would like to, or any questions about how to start using it in your work, I'll open it up to you guys now.
So Jacqueline, I'll start. My name is Laura de Boisblanc, and I'm with St. Ignatius Loyola Church in New York City, and you don't know me, but I sure know your name.
I
Since
am
you're coming to
coming,
our
yes.
church.
I am coming to your church, yes.
And I'm looking
Let's
forward
see.
to that on September 28th, where we'll do exactly this, right? You'll give us the demographics and we'll say, what should we do?
Yes.
So that's great. Yeah, we started working with, started working, I guess, in earnest with refugees and immigrants last year. And we went to the border, and we do a lot of things with Catholic Charities now, and we're hoping to get more people in the parish involved. And certainly having statistics of knowing what we're doing would help a great deal. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, for those of you who are not familiar, St. Ignatius on the Upper East Side in New York City is hosting an event where they're just talking about immigrants, in the area in New York City, people who they're serving, people who, they should be serving, and, the immigrant population. So I'm going to be speaking at that event, and just some of the immigrant, my role at that event is we talk about the immigrant breakdown in New York City and in their area specifically. So very happy to be part of that event. Thank you for the invite. And yeah, I guess I would just ask you then, Laura, have you found that your, parishioners are kind of take to those events, that they're interested in kind of hearing that? And has it been useful to your work?
Well, so when we started this, we had a morning of prayer and awareness after our trip to the border, and we had a Stations of the Cross for asylum seekers, and then we had a panel discussion with the priest down at the border and a few of us who had come to the border. And I think we had 40 people there, which I think on a Saturday morning is a pretty good turnout myself. So I don't know how many people will get out this, but one thing that I do know is when we started working with Catholic Charities is a very hard to organization to navigate from the volunteer point of view. Like if you want something from them, I think you can just go and say, I want whatever it is, and you can get it. But from our side, it was very hard to figure out how do we get there. And we have broken the code. We have people who have gone to their legal clinics to do screening for people. We have people, I'm the chair, so I got requests from Catholic Charities that we really need help. In August, 12 people volunteered to be conversation partners, which means that 1 hour a week, they would be talking to this Spanish-speaking person for 10 weeks. And I think that's pretty outstanding to get that kind of response. We've gotten other things too. And with the governors in Texas and Alabama sending people randomly up here, then they overran Catholic Charities and other organizations by sending them to the office as opposed to the place they were supposed to go. So we had more volunteers come to Catholic Charities to help the office workers deal with this influx of people who shouldn't have been there, but and are in a desperate situation and need somebody to take care of them. So we really like Catholic Charities, but and that's how far we've gone. And we want to get more people involved because it's a big parish, and we could do more. That's our plan. That's the thing. That's what it's called, faith-based response to the current refugee crisis. What can we do as an individual, and what can we do as a parish?
Yeah, your colleague Christine Meyer had told me that your parishioners are quite active and quite educated on the topic, and so that you have quite an involved community, and that's great. That's great. Thanks. Does anybody else have any word about how they've used research, how they hope to use research? Any questions about? Questions about it? Yeah, Audrey, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Audrey Hudgens. I'm an associate clinical professor at Seattle University, a Jesuit Catholic school in, well, Washington State, Seattle. Everyone knows where that is. I've done a variety of projects over the years for the Archdiocese here in Seattle, oriented mostly on inclusion and exclusion of immigrant communities and what a bright line there is in terms of attendance and a welcoming sort of orientation between a variety of parishes. You know, there's some parishes that are quite homogenous in their groupings, and I mean that in terms of both white and folks who speak other languages, which is primarily the dividing line, and how the church and the individual parishes approach that level of integration or effort to overcome the self-segregation. I'm not convinced that any of the work that we've done in the past has really made a great impact on that. It does seem like there needs to be an individual motivation within the parish itself to want to be more inclusive and engaged with other populations. So there's one end where we're aware that there's a lot of challenges with regard to immigration or migration. And so we want to volunteer and have that outward facing sort of focus like Laura was just talking about. But then there's also the awareness that there are actually people in my community that are Catholic, that are active, and we need to welcome them into our church. That research, again, doesn't feel like it's gone particularly far, but I continue to be focused on trying to support the Archdiocese here with research that meets their needs. But most of the work has been on focused on inclusion and exclusion, and mostly qualitative work.
Yeah, I think Seattle's really interesting. So I'm actually from Seattle. So it's nice to hear the local name. So I interviewed someone who used to be a Hispanic minister for St. Mary's Church. And so Liz, I'm sure you know all about it, given your background and given the research that you do. But for anybody who doesn't know, St. Mary's was historically the Latino parish. And so families would drive past literally a dozen churches in order to go to St. Mary's, because it used to be the only place where you could find a Spanish mass. And then for a time, there were 4 churches that provided Spanish mass. And I don't know how those numbers have changed with the parish closures over the past couple of years. But St. Mary's stands up as this really fantastic example of inclusion because they welcome in immigrants from everywhere, and they have like a food pantry, and they make it a point to register people right when they come in the door, and they invite them in. And then when people move away, they tend, if they have the means, they actually tend to come back so that they can still be a part of that community, unless it's just not feasible. But it is qualitative, but then it's also it would be interesting to overlay like some kind of quantitative information, because like how many people do they have, so that you could compare kind of like to like St. Mary's versus Christ the King. And then I don't know if she still works. The Archdiocese employed a statistician who was really, really great. And she was working to try to figure out how many Latino Catholics were in the Archdiocese. And she had, because the Archdiocese doesn't ask demographic information, parishes don't ask demographic information, she was going through this very long process of looking for surnames on baptismal certificates. Because even if families don't go to church, when they get married and have a baby, they baptize the baby. Right. And so then again, this is part of like where qualitative research intersects with quantitative research, is if you understand the population that you want to serve, things like, oh, well, why aren't they a part of the church? Well, because they move a lot and they can't handle all of these regulations and restrictions in order to participate in the sacraments, but they're still going to get their kid baptized, right? So there's this qualitative way of understanding the population that you're interested in. And if you could overlay that with quantitative information, you'd be able to get a better picture of what is and what is not working and why, so that you could kind of package within your archdiocese a couple of more to the point best practices. And they're not always going to fit everybody. But if there's not a lot of awareness that those are some of the really tangible outputs that could come by using research to both direct your information gathering and then apply it on the back end.
Yeah, so talking about some of the quantitative data, I'm more a quantitative researcher, and one of them, the webinars or gatherings, let's say, more of a chat actually, that CMS hosts generally in February is, maybe some of you have attended. I'm not sure because many people attend, and so I can't keep track of everybody who attends them because there's many faces in the chat, but it's basically a gathering of different Catholic agencies that want to kind of identify their research needs or their research ideas, let's say, what they would like research to be done on regarding Catholic services or Catholic agendas for advocacy or what have you. And so, in the past few years, one thing that we heard over and over and over again from Catholic agencies was on the idea of integration, between parishioners, and not only between parishioners, as you're saying, like immigrant parishioners and other U.S. born parishioners, but between parishioners and their immigrant communities, who are not necessarily of their same faith or whatever. They were saying, how do you preach in a way that essentially is not exclusive language, like because they were saying, especially during the previous administration, there was a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and many parishioners maybe were leaning for certain whatever political reason, were maybe leaning like hearing some of that anti-immigrant rhetoric, and maybe they were not necessarily associating their faith with being inclusive of immigrants. And so many Catholic agencies who work with immigrants were saying, how do we combine those things which have seemingly become dissociated due to like anti-immigrant rhetoric, because really, like, being a like a human serving Catholic, right? As we all know, it means serving the less fortunate, and many immigrants are vulnerable populations, as we know. And so they were saying, how do we kind of reunite those things which have been separated due to anti-immigrant rhetoric? Like, what communication strategies do we use? How do we preach that in a way that's effective? And like one, study that I was actually looking to do myself, which I hope to have results from, is what would actually happen if the priests in certain parishes, because priests are often assigned to where they go, they don't necessarily have a say in their placement. Maybe they have a preference, but it's more of an assignment. If the priests who are assigned to a place are of a different ethnic group or are immigrants themselves, does that change how people view immigrants in that community? And so I guess when you're talking, that's like a question that research could answer. Like, is that an effective way to kind of bridge the anti-immigrant rhetoric that's been separated from the person-centered faith, agenda that, we know as Catholicism? How do you bridge that? I guess is actually having clergy who is of an immigrant background in your parish, does that make a difference or does it not? And those are questions that like research can answer. And I think, maybe that's not the type of research that one would be doing in, a parish itself. But I guess then, like, the goal then is to, as us as a think tank, is like, we want to make sure that research that we do is communicated to the parishes, you know what I mean? So it's not research in a vacuum, because so many people were asking us, you know, how do we bridge that communication divide, you know? And so there are many ideas out there, but you can guess and guess and guess all you want about what is the best way to implement effective communication strategies, but it's really only questions that research itself can answer. It's like, what is the most effective, you know? So that was another thing that came up over and over and over again in our like Catholic research chats about communication research, you know? So.
Yeah, just to hop on that. I think it's very interesting how like we can have this conversation about like, how can we help you with your research, and like, how can research help you? But especially with parishes, and again, agencies might be a little bit different because a lot of my work is with parishes and dioceses. There's a intimidation factor, I think, with research. And so then there's a reluctance to use research because it's research. Well, one, it sounds really boring unless you're a researcher, in which case you get super excited and nerd out like I just did, talking with somebody about this database that they have. And I was like, oh, can I please help you with this database? This is amazing. I recognize that is not normal, right? So it's not normal to want like to have any attraction to research, to data. None of that is appealing, especially if you're really, really busy. And so I think there's something we need to change, like as researchers, I think we need to change something like Jacqueline was saying, like with the communication. So it's not just, oh, you need research and data so you know who it is that you're supposed to be serving. Because if you're slammed because you have so much work to do, because you have so many people right in front of you already, it's really hard to communicate to you, well, the validity of or the value in doing more research or doing more work when you think you already have enough because you do have limited resources. But I think that's part of why we have these talks every year at this conference, is that it's not that we necessarily are advocating that agencies or parishes do their own research, but understand that the research has been done. And that there are resources, there are people, I'm like, call me, email me. Do you want help with just figuring out who's in your diocese? It'll take me 10 minutes. I will send you the PDF. We'll answer any questions. I'm happy to do it. I'll put my email in the chat, right? Like there are people who are willing to do this for you and who really do want to help, so that when you have all of those people in front of you, it actually kind of helps to manage it a bit more so you can be more effective with your time. Like it's the whole work smarter, not harder kind of a mentality. But it is really hard to even get people interested in research because, again, sound like I can recognize it doesn't sound super interesting, but it is kind of the key to alleviating a little bit of the chaos.
Yeah, I'm just gonna hop on that too. I'm gonna throw another link in the chat. So CMS, and you're saying there's people who will do it for you. You know, CMS, we have a ton of data. We have so much data. And part of our new kind of agenda is to make that more available to the public. And the specific people who we want to make it available to is CBOs, Catholic agencies, like the people who need it. And the thing I hear from, you know, on the ground service providers is I don't have the time to do that when I have a million things to do. It's the last thing on my mind, you know, when I have, you know, like Ukrainians or Afghans showing up at my door over and over and over again and asking for this and that, and I can't even keep my head on straight. The last thing I'm thinking about is research. But what we want to do is make that like as easily accessible as to you as we can. And so we actually at CMS, we do have a wealth of data, and we have a data request form where you can just type it right in and be like, I'm looking for this or that or that. And where this often comes in, as I was saying, is in terms of programming. Like, so for example, you know, when Ukraine, you know, the Ukraine situation began, and they were thinking of designating it for TPS status. So CMS had information on how many Ukrainians would be eligible for TPS at a very local level. So if somebody is like, I'm an agency, I do systems navigation work, and my agency can help people navigate their TPS applications or, stuff like that. But I don't know how many people are going to be coming my way, right? Like, I have no idea. Is it going to be like 50 people coming my way? Is it going to be like 1,000? Like, I have no idea what to expect. I have no idea how many people, those are the kind of things that we can answer, right? Because so we know how many people are going to be in that area, and we can answer that. Another, example, this was not like for Catholic agencies, but just in a programming area, different states were wanting to implement. It was mentioned in one of the earlier, I don't remember if it was the plenary or the breakout session today. We're talking about driver's license for all programs, and different states want to implement those for undocumented immigrants. And they say like, but we don't know how many we're going to anticipate, right? Well, different state agencies have, asked for, data on the undocumented. So they know if we pass this legislation, like how many people are we talking about, in that state. And so it becomes very useful for programming, especially when it comes to stuff like legal services, case management, stuff like that, like how many people are coming my way. And like Catholic Charities, for example, one of the other chats right now, they're implementing a pilot project right now that's basically tracking, collecting data on people who are crossing the US-Mexico border and going to interior cities in the United States after passing their credible fear screenings. And then they're trying to connect them to case management services. And it's a pilot program, so it's still small scale for the case management, but they have this wealth of data on asylum seekers. And so they know, where people are going, what languages they're speaking. And so if you want to know like how many asylum seekers are coming to my city, stuff like that, that becomes very useful then for their planning. And what languages do they speak? What interpreters do I need to have ready? Who's coming my way? And so stuff like that for planning, it becomes quite useful. But I guess, do you all have any questions, any examples of, work that you're doing that you like, or any other, let's say, resources that you've used? As Kigo was saying, it's not necessarily that you need to do the research yourself, but any like resources in terms of research that you've found helpful, or that other people you've collaborated with for research that you've been working on that you found helpful.
This is in a Jesuit Catholic context, so, take that for what it's worth. There's a organization called the Jesuit Migration Network, Central America and North America, that has sort of 3 dimensions. One is research, one is advocacy, and one is accompaniment. And they sort of have an ongoing relationship with folks from all 3 of those dimensions across all of North America and Central America that meet on a regular basis to discuss not only work that they like. The research arm is the one that I'm associated with, and the idea is that we are collaborating on how we can jointly conduct research in order to be able to support the needs of the other 2 dimensions and beyond. And so I think that's an example. If people aren't familiar with it, and that's interesting, I can certainly provide more information on it. But sorry, there's a plane going over. What I really appreciate about that structure is it provides sort of a ready framework for us to be in conversation with each other, because academics are very much in the ivory tower and may not necessarily be connected to what's actually happening on the ground. And Jesuit Catholic institutions and perhaps broadly Catholic and other religious institutions in theory have a focus or a mission that extends beyond the ivory tower, because that's what we do, right? In theory, all universities are like that. Shouldn't just have to be the private ones, but anyway, story for another day. The point is that I don't feel like I'm really showing up in my role as an educator unless I am actually conducting research and teaching with a social justice orientation. And by that, I mean connecting what I'm doing in the classroom and in my work with my students to create social change. And so that's one organization that I think tries to do that. And so I've wanted the opportunity to throw that out there.
Jesuit Migration Network. Who's over there? Who do you work with over there?
I primarily work with Guillermo Ritzar, who's at Ibero Puebla, but the organization is much larger. I can search for a link here and put something in the chat.
Jesuit Migration Network. Great, thanks. And they do, so they do, you said accompaniment, advocacy, and so do they then have their own services as well? Like they do on the ground service work, is that the accompaniment part?
Yeah, think of it more as a consortium. So the folks that are associated with RJM Canada's accompaniment arm are like Keno Border Initiative and organizations like that. So the investigative theoretical arm or dimension that's run by Guillermo is basically any academic across Central America and North America that is associated with the Jesuit Migration Network. And then the accompaniment, or excuse me, advocacy folks are the variety of Jesuit works that participate in advocacy and also accompaniment. So there's some overlap there between those two.
Got it. Any other thoughts on that? I guess another type of research that CMS does that we don't really talk, we haven't really talked too much about. We've talked about the kind of the qualitative and the quantitative, but is I guess legal and policy research. CMS is doing some research right now that hopefully will be released towards about by year end, and it's on the immigration backlog, what's in the immigration courts, what's causing it, what could reduce it. And I guess, there's a lot of research to be done on policy as well. And some of that can overlap with quantitative work. We're working with some data from EOIR that we've gotten from them. But I guess, the research is also useful, not only from, you're saying you use it to supplement the other two arms, which are accompaniment and advocacy. And I guess using the research we've talked about it to like how to serve in terms of the accompaniment and like how to provide services, but in terms of using it for the advocacy, it can be quite useful. And it was very frustrating to me, when I was doing my PhD, doing my research, when I would see these people doing amazing research, and then it's just like, okay, but what are you doing with that? Like, why are you not communicating that to anybody? Because it has immensely useful implications, and it's kind of just like gone away into a vacuum, because there is a lot of, research being done. And I think something that CMS, I think I would like to do more of is kind of take some of that academic work and like communicate it, like streamline it in a way that's not just like this dense academic literature that nobody wants to read, you know what I mean? And kind of condense it down. Because like there really is a lot of research out there that can be quite useful for policy. Some work that I've done myself, for example, was on, as asylum seekers often, in certain countries in the world, they are not granted they're not granted permanent stay immediately. They're kind of either granted, a 1-year status or a 3-year status, and then they need to renew, and then eventually they can reapply for permanent residency. And you see that in the US as well too, right? You have a 2-year green card with your spouse, and then you're going to apply for a 5-year, you have these kind of short stints of uncertainty. So where even if you have a legal status, you can, you don't know you're going to have a legal status after that, right? It actually is like you're living in constant uncertainty. And we all know, like on the ground when we're working with immigrants, like this is a very stressful situation. This is a very, intensely stressful situation for immigrants to always be living under perpetual uncertainty. You see that with DACA, you see that with, and some of the research I had done myself was to try and be able to actually quantify, but what are the actual impacts of that on the economy then? Because if you go to, governments and you're like, don't do this to immigrants because it's giving them a lot of stress, lots of governments will be like, we don't care, we don't care, and it's an unfortunate reality. But what I, was trying to do with some of the research is show that, when you actually have people living under this constant perpetual stress of uncertainty, what it does then is it actually hinders people's integration, because maybe if they think they're only staying 1 year, they won't learn the language as quickly, or they won't invest in taking vocational training because it's a 3-year program and they only have a 1-year legal status, or firms will be unlikely to hire them because why would I hire somebody with a 1-year status when I could hire the other guy has permanent residency, and it creates all of these kind of frictions with people living under stress. And what that does is it actually has huge economic burdens, and especially in countries where we rely on a lot of immigrants to keep our economy running. And then it has, implications on the tax system and things like this. And so if you can go to governments and, when you're talking about advocacy, and you can say, implement these good policies for immigrants, not because it's good for them, but because it's good for you, if you can take the other angle, it's powerful in a different way. And so we're doing this program with Catholic Charities, and one of it with the analyzing the impact of these case management alternative to detention programs for asylum seekers. And we want to show, it's good, it's how it can facilitate people's integration, stuff like that. But what we also want to show is things and it doesn't have any impact on crime, and it doesn't have any impact on your welfare systems or your medical systems, you know what I mean? Because unfortunately, research can be used to show the benefits, the impact, the stuff for the immigrants themselves. But in terms of the policy angle, you have to also use research to show kind of not only why it's good for immigrants, why it's also good or not bad for you, And so I think that's another really useful and powerful way that research can be used to push Catholic agendas. By playing the devil's advocate, as one of the other people who's doing the chat on, he's by putting on your, devil's advocate hat, what would the critics say, what would they pick out at me, and how would I use research to combat that other narrative, So.
I have a question for you guys as practitioners, because, we're just talking about how sometimes research seems inaccessible and difficult and everybody's really busy. And I know that you guys at CMS are concerned about this as well. How can we make what we do find more accessible? Are there ways that we can make it more interesting, easier to find, easier to access? I just did a documentary on, former DACA recipients who are now living in Mexico, and people seem to being able to watch this 30-minute documentary better than watching than reading an academic article. But what are the ways that we can interest agencies, in information, and then also make it easier to read, easier to assimilate?
Well, I'll just appreciate the way in which you go about trying to share your work. It's never occurred to me to make a documentary. It's mostly because it's not my discipline, but I just sort of feel like I don't do film, I do migration, sort of thing. I'm a social scientist. So it calls me to sort of reflect on not only the creativity that probably went into that, but making your work so much more accessible to others. And so, you know, sort of at its foundation, how is it that we can think about our own work in new ways? And this being a really useful example of a way to broaden the appeal of the underlying work that you've done. So I think I would just express my appreciation for offering that example. It helps me think about my work in a different way.
To be 100% transparent, it was actually my colleague's idea. But I was very happy for it and it turned out well. And so now I'm actually trying to look to see if something that we can keep that's sustainable to keep doing.
I know at CMS, like just from tracking our website analytics, what people seem to like from us is just kind of like not even necessarily like new research, but just when you take everything and explain it concisely, you know, like our top viewed pages are like, what has Biden done on immigration in his first 100 days? Like, and then the update of 1 year, you know, like what was done, what were the policy actions taken, what were the implications, you know, and then the other one was like Trump's actions on migration. And, you know, just like these explainers that it's just like, there's so much information out there that it's almost like we forget that people aren't living in I live in the migration space all the time, you know, and yeah, I think sometimes I forget that myself, you know, because you're so surrounded by it that sometimes people just, I think people want just like a little, like, give it to me in a bulleted sheet. What do I need to know today? You know, like, I don't know, does that sound like useful or crazy to you guys? That's what our website and analytics say that people like. So yeah.
Well, I use that particular example in classes, particularly the election year. You know, I divided the students into two groups, and one of them took one of those and the other one took the other ones, and then they sort of had a debate with each other about it, and each, you know, picked a particular theme to focus on. And so that sort of, you know, information consolidation sets the stage in terms of my role as an educator in opening up students to, you know, the variety of ways that we could look at this data. So I particularly have not only used that exact, you know, thing that you're referencing, but also to invite my students into being more aware of these issues, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys we only have a couple more minutes, but you know, CMS, we have our like weekly newsletter, and that's one of the places where we try to condense things down to. So if you're not on it already, there's the QR codes floating around the conference rooms and on the registration table where you can sign up for it's called the migration update. So if you're not on it already, it's a good way. It is basically like the policy updates in English and Spanish, like just any updates to immigration policy, news around migration, both international and domestic, a few faith-based updates, and like CMS's most current work. And it's like a nice little condensed weekly newsletter where you're just like, oh, there's all the little snippets of research, news, policy in one space. So I'd encourage you to check it out if you're not on the list already. But